Hello, friends. That's my Joe Rogan impression. Hello, everyone. I just thought I'd give a bit of info before this episode. I'll be quick because it's a good one, and like to just jump into the conversation. So, basically, I'm talking to Sarah today, who is using a fake name, and I've also modified her voice because she wanted to be remain anonymous because of some of her stronger views, which you'll hear later in this episode. Also, we only had an hour that we could chat about it. So for this particular subject, I felt like we needed a lot more time to really try and go over it and scratch past the surface a bit more. So we recorded this hour, and this is part one, and there will be a part two, maybe a part three, but we're planning definitely for a part two to record and release soon. So that watch out for that. That will be coming out as well. But yes, without further ado, enjoy the show. Welcome to the show with me, Dan, and my guest, Sarah. How you doing, Sarah?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yes, very good, thank you. This is it's good we were just talking before going live, so to speak, about how it's been a while since I've done one of these, and I just first of all say thank you to you two that I actually have this opportunity to get back into it again. So
you're welcome.
Yeah, no, I enjoy them a lot, and I think today there should be a few really interesting things to talk about. And I think I'll just give some context to the listeners. So I contacted Sarah because of Sarah's professional background, which we'll go into. I've become more and more interested, just in my own time, I've just been more and more interested in sort of disinformation, what we put our trust in, why people choose certain sources over the other, and all the beliefs underneath that. And I think it's just a really interesting subject. And because of your background, Sarah, I approached you and said these are the sort of things that I'd really be interested to talk about. But then you sort of came back to me and you were sort of talking about some changes you're having in your career and your own reasons for that. So let's take all the mystery out of the way of what I'm hinting at. But can you talk a little bit, sort of a summation of your professional background up until now, and then sort of some changes you've been having recently and your thoughts?
Yeah, of course. So I have worked in the media for roughly 10, maybe 7 or 8 years now. I've worked for most of the national newspapers. I've worked for several magazines, and I've also worked for several radio stations. So and now I work in television as well. So I've kind of worked my way through, so to speak. And I think that came from, and I'll be completely honest, I think that came from a childhood desire to be impressive.
Right.
I think that when I was at school, I wasn't, the straight A student, and I was very creative, but I wasn't particularly good at, maths and science and everything else. And I think I was often sort of referred to as the artistic one, or the kind of, oh, yeah, she's the creative one. And I think I just kind of wanted to go, well, no, you know what, I can do this journalism thing. I can write, and that, in my head, that was probably the closest I could get to like an academic subject career-wise.
So actually, you saw it as breaking away from the more creative.
I think so. I think it was, what it is. It was an ego thing. I think it was kind of me wanting to be, if someone said, "Oh, what do you do for your job?" To kind of turn around and go, "I'm a journalist," and then and then list the paper. So I think it was quite a shallow thing to start off with. Obviously, I loved writing. I liked the creativity of writing. I did a lot of, when I first started, I did a lot of features, and I really enjoyed that. But I would say, I think I don't think that was ever really my place.
Mm.
I can go into that in more detail as we go along. But essentially, I started in journalism. I was very in love with it, and so my kind of goal at the time, I mean, this was probably maybe about 4 years ago, was to work for the Times and be a quote unquote respectable journalist.
Mm.
And it just kind of, I don't know what really happened, but I just sort of I fell out of, I mean, it was the COVID years that made me fall out of love with it, but I fell out of love with it. And it made me realize that actually, and it has, and we'll go into this in more detail, but covering COVID and everything else just really, really made me go, I can't do this anymore. I think that love and that kind of push for wanting to, climb and be impressive and all that sort of stuff, I think being in lockdown just really made me reevaluate my life, and work out what it is that I want to give back to the community and other people. And I think, you know, scaring them with scary news, which is, let's be honest, is massive at the moment. I just didn't want to do it anymore. It didn't sit with me. So now I've trained to be a yoga teacher, which is completely different. And yeah, I've just started doing that. So I'm doing one class a week at the moment, and I'm going to build up from there. But I am still writing, just because, you can't suddenly jump into that sort of thing.
So what was it specifically that made you fall out of love with journalism?
There's probably several things, really. I think, I mean, most journalists would agree with you on this one. The money is really bad. Like, for the hours that we work,
Mm.
and the amount of crap that you take off editors, and you know, the sort of just, it's just not really worth how much you get paid, if that makes
Mm.
sense, because you put a lot of work into it. And I think, don't get me wrong, if I know some people who have worked so hard, they are so in love with news and reporting, and they're doing very, very well. I think for me, it was largely, it just didn't quite fit me as a person. So I think I fell out of love with it because I I think it was probably when I went over to tabloids. So I started working for broadsheets, and enjoyed that, and just for a change of circumstances ended up going into tabloids, and just didn't have a great time with the. I just don't like. There's a lot of bully culture in some of the places that I've worked in. I think
Mm.
that left a sour taste in my mouth. And I think also the desire for negative news started to kind of bother me as well.
Mm.
I think that's a huge problem. Like, I feel quite passionate about talking about that, because it's a big issue. This whole, there's that old saying of, good news doesn't sell. Whereas I completely disagree with that. I think people are gagging for good news now, but because we
Mm.
don't get it, we're just constantly bombarded with negativity. And I think for me, that really started to bother me. And then when we hit COVID and lockdown, and I just found myself spending 9 hours a day writing about nothing but COVID. And I think yeah, I've spent a long time. I used to do crime writing. I've covered some really grisly cases, and I never really took that home with me. It didn't bother me on a personal level. But when, I think we're all in the same boat here. We've lived through a very challenging and strange time. When you're living in that, and then you're also working in that, and spending, 8, 9 hours a day writing about it, and then you leave, and then all your family want to talk about is COVID, and lockdown this, and Boris
Mm.
this, and all that sort of thing. It just was non-stop. And when we first started, where it must have been April 2020. So when it had just started getting serious, and I think lockdown, I can't remember off the top of my head, because there's just been so many different lockdowns now, but I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure that was when lockdown one started. Um, I did my first. I was doing a blog shift, like a blogging shift for a tabloid newspaper, because I think it's probably good to let the listeners know that I'm freelance, so I do a lot of work for lots of different places.
Mm.
But I was writing for a tabloid, and we were doing like a live coverage, of COVID as it was unfolding, and any updates. And this then went on for. Oh, usually we do blogs and they maybe last a couple of weeks, depending on what the subject is. But this continued for the whole of COVID, and it would be every 10 minutes you'd write an update on, an MP saying something, or a doctor saying something, or cases going up. And that is, for 9 hours, that is so bad for your mental health. And after the shift, I just, honestly, this sounds very dramatic, but I laid down on the floor and I just cried because I just felt like I just needed just to like let it out.
Yeah. Well, I guess there was that. I think there was a word or term that actually went into the dictionary that wasn't before during COVID, which was doom scrolling. And I think we all see that as from the consumer side, but actually from the side of the people that are producing the doom, how much must they feel of producing this all the time and having to look up all these stats and get all these really negative reports?
That's a really good question, actually, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because when it was peak lockdown, we were only allowed to go out for like one bloody walk a day and all this sort of, when it was really, really intense. Journalists are key workers, and there was a slight element where, and this is completely, and I'm cautious of how I'm going to say this because I don't want it to come out wrong, but there was this cheering for the people that worked in the supermarkets because good for them because they were keeping us all going, and cheering for the paramedics and cheering for the medics, and absolutely that should have, that's great, it should have been the case. But I think if ever I mentioned during COVID, I'm a journalist, there was a very different feel to when it was before COVID time. So right. It kind of was a bit like, there was a bit of a kind of a resistance from people when they found that out. And it made me quite paranoid. It made me kind of feel guilty and everything else. But I think despite my feelings about journalism now and media now, when it was peak lockdown, it was very hard to be sitting through and sifting through data and reports and listening to doctors and interviewing doctors and speaking to people who've been in hospital, speaking to people whose family had died from COVID, going through all of this stuff. It was so hard, but you kind of felt like you couldn't really say anything or vent about it because people are like, oh yeah, but you'd either get someone who'd say, oh yeah, but you're just spreading, fear mongering, or you get people who would say, but you're not really doing that much of an important job. But actually, in a way, we kind of were, because we were giving the information out that people needed. However, I think that the news outlets got carried away during the pandemic. I think in the beginning we were very vital, and I was quite proud of the job that I was doing. But as the pandemic went on, I think something changed, and this is just purely my opinion, but I think that the editors got greedy and enjoyed the amount of clicks that they were getting, and I think they then ramped up the fear, and that's probably for me the point where I went, no, I can't do this anymore.
So do you think that was an underlying thing that's always been in the media and it just came out more during COVID, or do you think
yeah, definitely. I mean, going back to it, there's that whole, good news doesn't sell. It's only the sort of, you just take a look at a website. You can take a look at any of them, The Sun, even the BBC, the Mirror, whatever. You look at their websites, the font is big and bold. The colours are either red or black. The pictures, usually when you're scrolling through a news page, the homepage, sorry, the pictures will be a scary graphic or something very bold. And from a psychological perspective, and I'm not an expert in that field, obviously, but that is enough for your brain to go, oh, I don't like that. Whereas if you look at something that's very aesthetically pleasing and calming, your brain will then receive, it will then react better to that. So, for example, if you switch on the nightly news, or, my parents are avid news watchers. I can't watch the news anymore. I don't watch the news anymore. But as soon as you turn the news on, you're met with this really dramatic entrance music, the drums and it's all quite serious. And then you're then met with a very miserable looking person sat behind a desk. And I know lots of these people who work in the news media, and they're lovely people, but you get them in front of a camera on, BBC Nightly News or whatever it is, and it's very serious and the voice changes and it's all very stern.
Yeah.
That is not good for people's mental health. It's just not. And I think now I'm working in more of a state, I'm working in wellness now, and I'm actually learning about how the brain works and how the nervous system works and everything else. It is toxic to be watching that stuff every day. And I'm going to add this as well. You've got me on the rant here, but when you're in the car and you're listening to the radio, you have the news every hour. It's not healthy to listen to doom and gloom, because let's be honest, that's mainly what it is. Every hour, it's really bad. And I've worked as a radio producer, and it wasn't until recently that I was like, oh, do people really want to listen to, like, cases going up and panic, and it's just not. I don't think it's healthy, if I'm being honest.
Do you think, though, just to sort of play devil's advocate, do you think that it's more that it wasn't healthy for you and you were? I know it's probably both of these reasons, but do you think it was more for your own mental health that you want to move out of it, or do you think it's because that you think the issues within media are so large that you don't want to be part of it?
Yeah, I think probably both. I think my own mental health was definitely the main thing, because I'd never had anxiety before 2019, and then suddenly and it was real physical anxiety. I wasn't sleeping. I would feel really sick all the time. My heart would be going. So it impacted me quite a lot. But no, I think a large part of it was. It was probably how. I think the thing that's really important for people to realise is that usually when you're reading a news piece, the person who has written it and the person whose name is on it, if you are potentially reading a tabloid, I would say, yeah, mainly if you're reading tabloids, but I would also say this is for, the Times as well, and the Guardian and Telegraph and all of that lot. But I would say if you are angered by the piece that you're reading, or if you think, how could they write about that, or look at that headline, it's awful, 9 out of 10 times it's coming from the editor. It's not the journalist. That's we get in tabloids, and I'll speak specifically to tabloids, we are told what to write. We don't have very much control over what we write. We can object to things, and I've objected to things in the past, but unfortunately, and I can say this for the Sun and the Daily Mail and the Mirror and Metro, you are sat on your desk and you are given a story from the editor. It's usually ripping off another newspaper story, and then you write it, and then you're on to the next one. It's not people. I think people think that journalism is everybody sat in these kind of offices with stacks of papers everywhere and telephones, and people skipping off to go and interview somebody and then spend all day writing it while smoking a pipe. It's not like that. It's a machine, unfortunately, and that's why a lot of my friends have left. They've left working for those places, because there's no real creativity, and you're basically just a copy and pasting machine.
Are you saying you don't smoke a pipe?
I don't smoke a pipe, no.
God.
I did used to smoke, though, but I've given that up, because I don't think it'd be very good to smoke and be a yoga teacher. It did make my voice sound pretty sexy for a while, though.
That would be very niche, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be.
Smoking yoga teacher.
Yeah, maybe I could try. No, smoking's bad, guys.
Especially if it was a pipe, like a huge pipe. That would be a good marketing. Well, maybe not, but
no, maybe not.
So, I mean, do you not think that it's a necessary, like, just to take these editors' point of view, do you not think it's a necessary part of the news? Like, if you don't make things bold, if you don't make them negative, then you're just going to fall behind and then fall into non-existence. It's the same, I guess, with my job, filmmaking. Now everyone wants, 30-second clips. They don't want to let a story really really get into a story, get to know the character. You want a TikTok video that's going to last 10 seconds and then you're on to the next one. Do you not think it's just a necessity? Do you think there actually is a place for more positive media that doesn't attack your mental health in the same way?
Yeah, I don't think that. I think there's just not a balance, right? I think, don't get me wrong, there's stuff going on in the world that is negative, and it has to be, of course, it has to be discussed and it has to be put out there. That's the whole purpose of journalism. But I think that we're missing the balance. I think there's been plenty of times where I'll give you an example. So, plane crashes, okay, and it's a massive crash, big explosion, but nobody dies. So thankfully, or maybe one, no, let's say nobody dies, and it was just like it was a crash, but it wasn't anything massively dramatic. That story probably wouldn't be picked up. If the plane went down, and again, wasn't a massive explosion, but 6 people died, then they would pick it up and they'd talk about it. But what I'm saying is, that's probably a bad example, actually. I'll give you another example. Plane goes down and 2 people crash. They're really old, like elderly people. And then in another story, a plane goes down and, maybe there's a really good looking wife and her, beautiful husband and a son. Then it would probably then get picked up. So often we would have a story where we would get the police call, or we'd see on the police Twitter that there'd been a massive pile up on the M1, and the first thing that journalists and editors will ask, did anyone die? And I just think that whilst it's very important to obviously make sure that we are covering serious stuff, this kind of thirst for the sort of macabre is, I think it's too much. I think.
Do you not think that's a direct consequence of consumer demand?
Yeah, of course. This is the thing, though, and this is I'm not going to just sit here and slag off the newspapers. I think that the reason we write this stuff is because people click on it. But equally, I think that journalism has a responsibility to manage what we put out a little bit more. I think. Be a bit more aware. There's all of these little newspapers and outlets popping up, which are all positive news. You've got Good News Movement, you've got Positive News, you've got the Happy Newspaper, you've got all of these coming up. People are honestly, I really think people want that stuff. So I think, yes, it is very good, and it is important to discuss, life isn't all rainbows and flowers and everything, and I do understand that, but I think that there are a lot of stories that editors are not interested in if they don't have some kind of gruesome twist, or, oh my God, everyone was massacred, or, Jesus Christ, everybody's going to die because of this horrible thing that's going on. I think that they would just need more balance because there isn't enough of it at the moment.
I mean, do these other news outlets, because that was going to be my question, if any of them, are any of them successful, or any of them, can you see any of them?
Yeah, they're set up by, you look at the Times or the Sun, it's a multi-million-pound business. They're huge. It's these little outlets that are popping up. I don't know. I don't have the stats in front of me of how many people read them or whatever, but there are a lot of them on Instagram and they've got massive followings. I mean, I know that the Happy Newspaper, which was created by Emily Coxhead, I think it's Coxhead or Coxhead, I'm not entirely sure, but she's on Instagram and she created this, and it's massive. If I think it must have several million followers, which obviously is not massive in the grand scheme of news, but it does show that there are a lot of people that are interested in this, and unfortunately they don't have the same budgets that the big newspapers have. But I think that just shows that people do want. Why do you think so many people like watching junk TV? It's because we all need a little bit of a break and we need a bit of an outlet where we don't, we're not surrounded by that. I don't know. I just think that there is, when I was working at Tabloid and I'd pitch stories, I would know which ones would get taken, and it would always be the really, really horrific ones. You could get a really wonderful story about, I don't know, I can't even think of an example, but you could have a really nice story and it just wouldn't get picked up. And I just think that editors need to give those stories a chance, because I think that a lot of people need that.
Do you think it's more on the responsibility of the media outlets to be more balanced, to be more positive with some of their news stories, or do you think the onus is on the consumer to go, well, if I consume news all day, I'm not gonna feel good, and therefore, I better just be careful with my consumption?
That's a good question, and to be honest, I don't really know the answer to that. I think that people are starting to speak out against the media. We've seen a lot of it. I would say in the last couple of years. I know quite a lot of people who don't listen to. So when I was younger and when I was, in my early 20s and I first started at a broadsheet, I used to get quite cross with people when they'd say, "Oh, I don't read the news. Oh, there's nothing I can do about it. It's all just negative." And I used to just think, well, that's very ignorant of you, because surely it's good to know what's going on in the world. And whilst I still do agree with that to a certain extent, I also now can kind of see where they were coming from, because I think there's this whole thing of, and I'm going to sound very yoga teachery now, but there's this whole thing of, what can and what can't you control. And I think whilst it's good to know what's going on and be aware, obviously it's always good to be aware, I don't think it's good to become consumed. And I watch people on the train, I've watched my partner do it, just sitting and just scrolling, like you said, doom scrolling through, story after story about, awful things that are going on. And I don't think that that's good.
And you didn't want to stay in the news to, like, it's a whole sort of EU thing of like, well, we stay in the EU and we can change it from within. Did you not want to stay in within the news to change
honestly,
it?
I tried. There was, there's, at the end of the day, I only have so much control. I will pitch as many stories as I can, but if they say no, that's it. I don't have, I'm not able to have control over that, unfortunately. So, I think, don't get me wrong, I'm not, I'm coming from quite a negative spot on this, because I've not had the best experience in the world. I'm sure if you spoke to other journalists, they'd probably completely disagree with what I'm saying. But I think that, I tried to a certain degree. But I think it's just a bit exhausting. It's just a bit exhausting to just constantly try and come up with other ideas, and just constantly, you just know that they're not going to say yes.
Yeah.
But I think,
sorry.
No, that's okay. I was going to say, I think there are changes, though. I've worked in a well-known tabloid that's well known for ladies being naked on one of the pages and all this sort of thing. And a lot of people asked me, what's it like, working for that newspaper? And I'd kind of say, is it not really sexist and all this sort of stuff? And honestly, that place is starting to change from the inside, because there are loads more female editors. There are a lot more kind of, I think because more women work there as well, we're kind of going, I don't think we really need that picture of that woman in a bikini on a story about how she's died. I don't really think that's necessary. I think there's more people that are kind of going, no, not sure about that. It's still a very slow process, though. So yeah.
So it's interesting, because we sort of started and we're talking about sort of like the criticism that journalists get, and the sort of the lack of understanding, and lack of or the sort of stigma they face of, like, you do nothing, and but you also have your own criticism. So in sort of short, what would you say are the valid criticisms of the news, and what would you say are the more stigma or the not so valid criticisms that people have about it?
I'm really sorry, my love. You're going to have to ask that one again, because I'm not entirely sure what you mean.
Sorry, because we were saying, like, during the pandemic and stuff, like, people were very critical of journalists and have.
So basically, you want me to give you good points about the news and bad points about the news?
Yeah, what you think are valid criticisms of the news, and what you think actually people should be less critical of, and what you don't think are sort of valid criticisms. So yeah, so valid and invalid criticisms.
Yeah, I think I think it's good for people to remember that we are regulated. You often get people saying, "Oh, the news is just full of lies," and it's like, well, legally we can't lie, because we will get taken to court. I remember when I did my training, I had the life scared out of me, because they said, if you get something wrong, or if you fabricate something or whatever, you, not the newspaper, you will be taken to court.
Is that I think, is it the same amount of regulations for newspapers as TV, or is there more regulations?
There's more on TV.
Right, yeah.
There's definitely more leeway with newspapers, but what I would say is that I would say that there's still an element of fact checking, obviously, we have to go to police for things. We have to go to people for comment for things as well. You'll often see at the bottom of a newspaper, it will say, the Star has gone to such and such for their comment and all that sort of thing. So we are, it's not cowboys and Indians. We are, relatively regulated. So I would say that's one thing for people to remember. I would also say that the news, you do need the news to a certain extent. I think people forget how important it is. As much as I've just kind of moaned about how negative it can be, it still is. It's still a good way of making sure that you know what's going on in your local area as well, because I'm speaking on a national news front. Local news is so important. I would say, if anything, local news is more important than national news because it directly affects you. So I would say that's positive about the news, and it's important to stay in touch with what's going on. But I would say negative wise, it's what I think what people should bear in mind is to not just go on headlines. I know that sounds quite basic, but you've got often and I'm talking again probably more of a tabloid. I personally read BBC News, and I prefer their way of reporting because it's very straight. But if you look at tabloids in particular, if you've got 5 things in a tabloid story and maybe 2 of them are positive and 3 of them are sort of scary, and they will always be put right at the top, and then the story becomes about that and less about the things that maybe aren't quite as scary. There is I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I have had stories before where I've been given a report to cover, and the report is largely positive, but there's one thing in there that's a bit like, oh, be careful of this, or this could happen, and that's what we focus on. So I think it's very important to, when you are reading articles, is to really read the whole thing, because often the stuff that's more realistic, maybe I could say, is further down the bottom. And I think it just goes back to what you were saying. I think it's good to just remember that there are agendas, and newspapers, they have their sways on things. And I just think it's very important as a reader to remember your own stance and how you feel about things. I don't know if that really makes sense, but that's what I would probably say.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And I think you mentioned the BBC, and I think that would be a great sort of thing to segue off into a little bit and go down more the sort of trust route, which I'm fascinated in. So you said you get your information mainly from the BBC now. So can we play a little game of devil's advocate with the BBC, because I am a huge BBC advocate. So I think that if I just sort of agree with you, I don't know if it will be as interesting. And I think is it okay if I sort of take on that role and be more sort of to challenge it? So why do you trust the BBC?
I think, well, let me just retrack a little bit. I think I'm still quite skeptical of news in general. But whenever I am on a BBC website, as opposed to the Daily Mail, for example, I find that the BBC is a lot less sensational, and it just reports news as news. Like it's just simple, straight up news reading, as opposed to the Daily Mail that's often just kind of pumped full of scary adjectives, and it just gets a bit too much. So I think that's probably why if I do have to read news, and if I choose to sit down and have a little flick through, I will just click on the BBC, because I know I'll get a general overview. It won't be anything too kind of anxiety inducing, and that's kind of that, and I'm happy with that.
But does that make it trustworthy?
But I don't fully trust. No, but I was just going to say I personally, now I've been in the industry, I would probably take a large pinch of salt with most pieces that I read, but less so with the BBC. So I still take a pinch of salt, but not quite as much.
So why do you take less of a pinch of salt with the BBC?
because again, they're still a news outlet and they still need to get clicks. So, I'm talking more about the news site rather than their TV, their TV news. But they still, that's how they make money. So they still need to have a certain amount of that to it. And also, let's not forget the BBC's government funded. So there's also that element of it as well.
But why do you trust the BBC more than these other news outlets? Is it because they're sort of less sensationalist? Or
I think that, but also having worked, so I've worked in BBC Radio. There's so much red tape in the BBC. Oh my God! Like, they're very cautious about stuff, and much less cautious than the Mail, for example. And I think that could be to do with the fact that maybe the Mail has a lot of disposable cash. They've got a lot more money, whereas the BBC obviously, their payments every year get scrutinised and everything else. So I think that could possibly be part of it as well.
So the regulation is a key thing. So
yeah.
Sorry, this is going to get, maybe it could seem more and more. What's the word? Getting anal about it, or getting
yeah, no, that's all right.
But why do you trust the regulators of the BBC? Why do you trust that they have a good agenda? Do you not feel that there's that sort of like risk of more of a sort of Big Brother type thing of Ofcom and the government, and trying to push their own, well, not the government, but yeah, Ofcom pushing their own agenda, and it's all sort of tied in with that? Do you not feel that regulation could be corrupt in itself?
I mean, potentially. I don't want it to sound like I'm sort of like majorly pro BBC, because I'm, like I said, I don't particularly like news in general. After my experience, I don't really, like I've said before, I don't watch the news. I don't read the news anymore. I will, just to sort of keep track of stuff, but I don't watch it religiously or read it religiously. So I'm sure there's still probably a certain amount of dodginess, so to speak, that goes on at the BBC. Like, I'm definitely not going to I don't know, I've not worked in that department, so I can't really comment on that. I can only comment on the ongoings of the tabloids and the broadsheets because I've worked there. But I think every single outlet has a certain amount of control and government control, and there's political, there's Rupert Murdoch, for example. He's basically in bed with Boris Johnson, so it's kind of there's always an agenda, and this is what I was saying earlier, there's always an agenda, but I feel like the BBC has less. So as much as I get what you're doing, you're playing devil's advocate right now, you're playing devil's advocate with someone who's kind of on your side, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, I think that if I was a BBC employee, I'd probably be able to kind of say, no, we do this and we do that. But I think, just talking purely from a reader's perspective, I just don't find it so mentally draining and anxiety inducing when I look at their stories, because it is just often written quite straight. I think the problem that I have is with other papers where it's the facts get lost and the drama gets amped up a little bit more. But to say that the BBC are completely innocent and that they don't have agendas, I'm sure they do.
So let's go a bit wider with the question. So how do you determine what to trust? And you can have a think about it, but so not just the news, so any information you get about anything, how do you determine what you will, you don't have to put your wholehearted trust in, but just like, yeah, I'm gonna trust that's true, about anything to do with health, with the economy, with science, like stats about whatever, about nature. What are the processes? What are the sort of red flags for you? How do you put more trust in something than something else?
That's a difficult question, to be honest, because I think those different categories you listed are quite different. So if we were talking about nature, for example, I would trust an ecologicalist. I can't say that word.
Ecologist.
Oh my goodness, ecologist. Yeah. I would trust an ecologist, or I would trust, if David Attenborough was spouting off about something, I would go, yeah, no, I like him, and I know that he's a good person, and I know that he, you can't really have an agenda with nature. Science, again, would probably put my trust in scientists. However, and this is probably, I don't know if this is kind of where you wanted me to go with this, but to be honest, after working in the news for several years, I don't have a huge amount of trust in some specialists, say, as in I don't want to sound like I don't want to go down the conspiracy theory route, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think it's worth remembering that, if we're speaking about pharmaceuticals, it's a multi-million-pound industry. So I think, for me, if I'm reading something about health, I will absolutely, if a doctor, if a registered certified doctor is talking about something, I'll definitely take it on board. But again, it's about taking that tiny little pinch of salt, because I think sometimes we can be a little bit naive, and we can kind of just go, oh yeah, well, if this person's saying it, then it must be true. And I think it's just good, personally, this is just my own opinion, to just keep a little bit of yourself, just to kind of go, okay, but it's good to remember this. I think if you're reading a story about something, read lots of stories about that one thing. Look at lots of different experts talking about that one thing. Get a really broad and wide, reach on something, to get a little bit more of a sort of an idea of something. Because I think otherwise, if you're just reading it from one source and taking that as gospel, I don't personally think that's very good. So going back to your question about trust, I think typically, as a general answer, I would say I would trust experts, and I would trust people that have trained and gone to university or studied something, or whatever it is, or they're very passionate about something. But I would also say that I think we're not kids. We all have brains. We all have our own opinions. I think sometimes we can, I think I've had this problem where people will read something in the news and will, for example, lockdown or COVID. I know somebody who won't leave their house now because they're terrified. They don't have any underlying health problems. They're a very healthy, normal person. I'm not dismissing COVID and the seriousness of it, but at the same time, they've scared themselves so much by reading all this stuff, and probably potentially not maybe looking at the actual kind of hard facts of things, and they've gone on the sort of scary headlines, and now they've terrified themselves. So I just think it's about having self-regulation as well.
So I mean that was stepping out of the devil's advocate role for a second, but the advice about experts and also a broad range of different views seemed to be very good advice to me, and it's difficult to argue with that. I guess I'm just thinking of people that will have stuff to say against that as well. So I think, especially with the vaccines, it's just thrown up so many of these questions about trust. And because any sort of, I don't know where you fall on vaccines, I don't know if you want to say, but any sort of people who are against the vaccines, if I was to say to them, well, sort of a broad range of experts seems to be a summation of what you were saying. They would say, well, I've listened to many different experts and who are doctors, and they've said this is all the government trying to control us, and these doctors have worked in Pfizer many years ago, or and I've listened to many different types of them who are slightly different. Then how do we come back at that? Because if they are trying to find out these experts, these people with these labels at the front of their names, and they're still coming up with something so different to someone, and it doesn't matter who they are. They can be the most sensible people in the world, but when you've got people that are so different in their idea of what the facts are, where's the common ground in that they can both find the facts that they agree on?
To be honest, I can't answer that. No. I think the problem is with conspiracy theories is there's always been conspiracy theories since the beginning of time. However, and I don't know if I've said this before, but back before the internet was a thing, the only people that you'd hear opinions from were, people of note, or people in power of some description or whatever. You'd see them talking on television or whatever. Whereas now, anybody can get Twitter. And the problem with conspiracy theories is often they'll take something that is true, and then there will be something else added to it, and they believe it. They're not like these evil people that are trying to scare everybody. They genuinely believe this stuff. They will then add something to it, which then isn't true. But because there's so much truth muddled in with it, it's very difficult to disprove them. And there has been some conspiracy theories in the past that have been proven true. So it's difficult it makes it very muddy and very messy. And I think the whole vaccine stuff that's been kicked up recently is incredibly problematic. And, I'll be honest with you. There's been I have been very half and half about it. There's been I am now double jabbed, but it took me a long time to get it because I was scared. Because I'd go on Twitter and I'd stupidly type in vaccines and see what people were saying, and I'd just be like, oh my god, I don't think this is a good idea. But then I'd interview a doctor for ITV the next day, and then would be like, oh no, actually they make a lot of sense. There's so much information coming from everywhere, and to be honest, I think it's a problem. I don't think I can't really say a solution for it because I don't think there is one. I think, unfortunately, it comes down to regulation again. It comes down to, but how do you regulate that? Because it's technically freedom of speech. So again, it's difficult, and it just again calls on a little bit of common sense and a little bit of people not just sitting there being spoon-fed all this stuff, and to kind of actually question with their own minds, if you know what I mean. I don't know if that answers the question, to be honest, because I think it's quite a difficult one to answer.
And I just want to clarify, I'm not expecting you to come up with all the answers. It's more just sort of spouting my own sort of confusion.
No, it's a good question.
Yours, and I think
it's a good question,
and it's interesting because even the people that very much believe in I don't even want to call it conspiracy theories, just have very different views to the mainstream. They do a lot of research sometimes, and they do use their common sense in their own way of like really trying to figure out what's going on. And it's
if you want to know about vaccines, and this is something that I had a problem with, and this is something that I don't know if you'll be shocked. I'm not sure. When I was working for news, I now don't. I work in a different department now, just to get a break from it. Any story that questioned the vaccine or that was negative about it, or there was one where I was in a meeting and we were going to be doing a piece about vaccines, and one of the journalists said, "Oh, just been reading this thing about how it really seems to be affecting women and periods and all this sort of stuff," and just asking a question, and the editor just went, "No, we're not going to talk about that." And that's probably one of the problems I've really had. Because it seems
like it would be a good story, like to buck the trend.
Because that doesn't help the NHS, and it doesn't help. At the end of the day, the government is saying we need to get vaccinated. So
yeah, but it's not. Newspaper editors wouldn't be making the choice for their conscience, would they? Surely.
I don't know. I think it's because it's different. I think usually no, but we're in a pandemic. So if the that would kind of be almost a crime. If the newspaper started to, don't get me wrong, if suddenly people were dropping down dead and it was suddenly getting really quite scary, then yes, absolutely, the newspapers would obviously have to pay attention to it. In my experience, it's just been little kind of flags here and there of people going, "Oh, did you hear about this woman who got it and then she died?" And I don't know, and this sort of stuff. It's not been big enough. It's been small enough for the newspapers to ignore, and the reason for that is because, again, newspapers are in bed with politicians. So if the politicians are urging everybody to get jabbed, they're kind of going to go with that. But I know what you're going to say. We then have to hold politicians to account. And obviously Boris has been a bit naughty at the moment. Well, very naughty in my own opinion. We do have to hold them account to a certain degree. But when COVID first started and when vaccines started, I got an email from an editor basically saying, we're going to have to get behind these vaccines. We're going to have to support this. We want to be encouraging people so that the country can move on and so that we can all get on with our lives and all this sort of stuff. So that kind of was the mandate that was set. anything that then questioned that was just kind of ignored. And there has been negative news stories about vaccines. It's not difficult to find them, and they've all been covered, but they will not be as jumped on as positive stuff. I don't know the answer for that.
I still don't get that though, because I get that there are all newspapers have a political preference. So
yeah.
Boris Johnson is in, it will be the Mail, the Express, the Telegraph, the Times that will be the star. Generally, the Sun, they'll be the ones generally. Obviously, they do criticise as well, but. That get behind the Tories, and then then you've got the Guardian and the Independent, and I guess the Metro and the Mirror that will be getting behind
Labour,
Labour and left wing and against the Tories. So that still doesn't. I get that would be your experience if you were working in a more right leaning newspaper, but that it still doesn't explain why the editors of the more left wing newspaper wouldn't be.
And I can't. To be honest, I couldn't comment on those guys, because I've seen a lot of stories. The Guardian have questioned it a lot more. So during COVID, I've been very much tabloid involved. So from my experience working with a big television company and also a tabloid, it's been much more pro-jab. I can't necessarily speak, but that, for me, that didn't really sit very well. I didn't like that. No. I thought that was quite. I thought it was, I would say, almost criminal, because you're ignoring stuff, and you're going, well, I'd like this, but I don't like this, and I'm going to write about this, but I'm not going to write. It's very selective, and all I know, and I don't know the answer for it, but all I know is that we were told that we had to get behind it.
Yeah, that's really strange to me. That's a flip, because it's like these newspapers, which are always banging on about free speech, and if we want to invade people's privacy because this footballer is shagging this person, then it's our right as a free speech outlet. But with this vaccine stuff, it is weird, and I think it's my main criticism of what I've seen. I mean, mainly from the BBC, because that's what I mainly consume. I think there has been a massive gap in debate about it. And
I agree.
There has been some, and I think over time it has got a bit better, and I think the BBC have improved the way they said stuff and in some ways showing the other side. But it's even to this day, like I was reading yesterday about the whole periods thing, and how it's there have been studies of it getting worse. But this one article, I knew it would happen, but it was happening so quickly. It's like they're like, oh yeah. The tone of the voice was like, oh yeah, there's some periods, some heavier, and it's it's quite bad. But these people are saying that it's all fine and it will be over within a month, and don't worry about it, and it's all linked to anti-vax stuff. So just that's how it feels. It's very much like. So I think that is a huge problem.
Definitely, and I'm very much on the same page with you. I'm the same. I don't quite understand why. And when I was, there was a period of time where I didn't want to get a vaccine because of the stuff I was reading about how it affected periods and the menopause and everything else. I just thought, that doesn't sound right. Like, come on. And if I'm being honest with you, the only reason I got mine done was because I was bullied into it, because otherwise I couldn't travel, and I wanted to go on holiday because we've all been in a horrible lockdown for a year and a half. So, if I'm being honest with you, I personally, I would be on the fence more about it, but I was sort of backed into a corner, which is another debate for another time. But I think that the lack of questioning and the lack of, it doesn't take much. You go and click on, a breakfast TV program, and they're talking about the vaccines. I mean, you look at who they've got on the TV. I've got to be really careful with how I say this, because I have got quite a lot of fingers in pies with all these people. But if you look at who they interview, if you're talking about the vaccines, you've usually got 2 doctors, the vaccine specialist. You might have one person who I don't know, they were on a COVID warden and they had the vaccine and suddenly they were alive again, and, have some miracle story, and then maybe you've then got one person who might be a little bit anti. But usually they'll choose a crazy anti person so that it's almost mockery. It's almost kind of like, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. These experts clearly do. Go get jabs. This is the thing, and this is the problem that I had, and this is, along with the negativity of the news and along with the constant COVID reporting, which I don't think is necessary anymore. This obsession that we have with COVID, plus the lack of, I suppose, free speech and the lack of, I know people who work in TV that won't allow anti-vaxxers to come on. And when I say anti-vaxxers, I don't mean, people who never ever want to vax their kids, and and that's fine if they don't want to do that, that's up to them. But when I say people, I'm just saying people who are against the COVID jab. I think there's a difference. I think, unfortunately, there was this whole thing that it's all right to be terrified of COVID, but it's not all right to be terrified of a jab. And I think that for me, that was a bit problematic. The newspapers were very much kind of, COVID's really scary, but the jabs are really great. And if you don't like the jabs, then you're an awful person, and poo on you. And it just that didn't sit with me.
Yeah, no, it's really, I think we're exactly on the same page.
I think we're very much on the same. Yeah, there's no debate with this one, I'm afraid.
No, it's good to just hear. Yeah, I think what it highlights for me though, so I feel like the area we're maybe a bit different is that where the problem lies, and I think we're pretty close to, there's no difference. But maybe if I compare myself to someone who does believe there's sort of like there's more of a top-down sort of like trying to control us type thing, and it's all sort of dirty dealings going on and stuff. I think I don't see that being the problem that is causing all these media outlets to not have a debate. I think the problem lies with the media going about it wrong, and the media, and but it's such a nuanced problem that I can see why. I mean, so many people I know are very skeptical now about something that I think if the media had just invited so much more debate. Like, there was someone I was speaking to who's very anti-vax, and I was trying to get them to watch GB News instead of the stuff they were watching on the internet, because GB News, for me, it was like a haven out of the mess of the internet. It was like they're regulated. Really? Yeah, I know it sounds crazy.
Ooh, that's interesting. I completely disagree with you on that one, but go on.
The only reason I say that is because GB News for me, even though I'm not, obviously I'm a BBC fan, so I'm not going to be a huge fan of GB News. For me, it was the only one I could see that was actually inviting debate and genuine debate about not just the vaccines, but also the lockdown protests and all these sort of things. So it was like, it was the best of a bad. It was better than the quagmire of the internet, where people are just watching some YouTuber who doesn't have a clue what they're talking about, spouting some stuff. It's like, no, well, go to GB News, like a gateway drug to more sensible news type thing.
Yeah, and I suppose it's kind of they were almost a little bit Piers Morgan-esque. I mean, I don't particularly like GB News, purely because I think it's basically like the Sun newspaper, but in like a TV form. I think it's very aggressive. I don't love the presenters that are on it. I've worked with them, so I think it's probably a personal thing. But I find that they're very sort of like talk radio-esque. It's, I don't know. I'm not a massive fan. But I think I will agree with you on the fact that they do challenge things that maybe other places don't. And I think there's that Piers Morgan, for example. You can love him or you can dislike him. I'm sort of half and half with him. There's lots of things he's done where I've been like, that's not good. But I do think he's very good at just cutting bullshit and just asking the questions that actually need to be asked. And I think your use of the term quagmire is really good, because I think that's spot on. There is a certain element of everybody just kind of collapsing in, and when I say everybody, I mean the newspapers, and just kind of almost all following each other like sheep, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
If the Mail's done something, then I guarantee you the Sun editors will go, oh, the Mail have done this, so we should do it, and then the Mail do exactly the same thing. It's very strange, like they copy each other all the time. But no, I think you're right to encourage your friend to not just sit and watch YouTube videos, because anybody can be an expert nowadays. That's the problem. And like I said, going back to the conspiracy theory issue, not saying your friend is a conspiracy theorist, but with that problem is there is truth in conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theory itself is usually, I mean, there's so many, it's difficult to kind of put them all in one ballpark, but they're usually incorrect or not true. There's the crazy ones that just you listen to and you just think, really? Do you really believe that? But there are other ones and you kind of think, So I think it's difficult. I think it's a difficult one to kind of say. And also, there's also the argument that maybe not all anti-vaxxers are conspiracy theorists. Maybe they just welcome a little bit more of freedom. And like I said, I wouldn't have got mine done if I wasn't forced to for travel. So
yeah, and I definitely don't agree with this sort of tarring of the same brush of the anti-vax, because it's everyone's got their own reason and it's different. I personally I have my own views on the vaccine, and but I'm always under the impression of like really trying to empathize with people, and I think because I've tried to empathize with the people who don't want the vaccine and have these sort of grand views on what's really going on, I can see why they've got there if the news is all banding together and trying to shut down any anti-vax stories.
Suspicious, right?
Exactly. It looks so suspicious.
It does. It does. I know it does. And this is the thing. And this is coming from someone who works directly in it.
Yeah.
So I think I also think that there's a lot of my journalist friends will they're all like pro-vaccine and sort of, it's almost like there's. It's difficult because I don't want to sound like I don't want to go down that route. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. Like I said, I've had mine done, so I'm not bashing that. But what I'm saying, to be honest, I don't know what to think about it anymore. But in my mind, if we're all going to grow 3 heads and whatever, then every single person I know has had it done. So I'd rather be in the boat with everyone. I know that sounds mental, but a lot of my friends who work in the media, they're all like, oh no, it's definitely. I remember sitting in one of the TV studios and one of the producers was kind of going, I just don't understand why nobody would want to get vaccinated. Like, it's just selfish, it's this and it's that. She was really going for it. And I just thought, shut up. Like, you don't know what people are scared of. There is still the fact that this is all quite new and it's all a bit scary and stuff. But I mean, everybody will have different opinions on it. But I do think that there definitely is an element of like weird pro-vaccineness in the media. And I don't. I think like I said, I think it's because I think it will cause pandemonium if the newspapers started spouting more questionable stuff about the vaccines. I think we have enough people who don't want to get it done. And like I said, I'm kind of an on the fence person. Part of me thinks, come on, we need to all get it done so we can get over this and just move on. The other part of me thinks, I don't get the flu jab. I don't know if I need to. Surely it should just be the vulnerable people. I don't know. I'm very sort of up and down about it. And I like I said, I'm not against anybody's views or anything, but I do think that if newspapers started putting out really scary stuff about the vaccine, if there is scary stuff that's not of a conspiracy theorist kind of, it's Bill Gates chipping you with a vaccine or whatever, which is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think people would lose their shit, so to speak. And I don't think that's. I think.
So you think the damage has already been done, type thing? Is that what you're saying?
We're already in a pandemic. That's difficult enough as it is. People have had a really, really rough time these last couple of years. I don't think we then need the media to then start giving us mixed messages about the vaccines, because I think that would then cause. I think they had to choose one side or the other, and they chose that they were pro. That's just, again, I'm not an editor. I'm not up there. I haven't been there for conversations about the vaccine, so I can't really speak. But that's just my opinion.
Fair enough. I'm very pro debate. And I think at any stage, obviously, it would have been good to have it as early as possible, continuing. To have debate going on, not in the newspaper. I mean, this may be more my personal preference sneaking in, but on BBC, on news channels, any news channel, to be honest, because I think if, like, let's say ITV News or Sky News started doing like regular debates about it and having people on who knew what they were talking about on both sides, credible people citing studies, let's say, the whole menstruation thing, having credible people on both sides, then I think it would have benefited them, because more people would be going, oh, actually, these people are talking about these things openly. And it would have had so many less people being distrustful of the media, because they're having this open debate. Because for me personally, when I've had big revelations in my life, some of the time, or a lot of the time, it's been when I've watched or listened to a really good debate, and I just get to hear both sides, and then I go, well, I'm going to make up my decision on that.
I think it's good to remember that newspapers, if you're looking at a newspaper story, if I've done an interview, say for example, I've done an interview with a doctor, we're talking about jabs and periods, as we were just talking about a moment ago, and they gave me some really good quotes, maybe, I don't know, 200 words worth. I don't have to put all of those 200 words in. I can choose what I want to put in. Legally, I can do whatever I want. Obviously, I can't change it, and I can't, manipulate it, although that has been done in the past. I don't have to put everything in. So, whereas with a like you said, with a debate on TV, and you've got people who are live, that's the live ones are the important ones to watch, because otherwise you don't know if they've been edited and whatever. But if you're looking at a live debate, I would say that's probably way more trustworthy than reading a newspaper article of the same discussion, because that could have been cut.
I think this could potentially push people more towards podcasts. It was already moving in that direction anyway.
I agree.
And I'm not saying for myself, I mean sort of like the big, the big podcasts that are out there, and there's so many now. You really have your choice.
The issue with podcasts, again, is like what we were talking about with the vaccines, is how much regulation do they have, and who are hosting the podcast. If you might have a really great, credible guy or woman who's hosting a podcast, and they get really good guests on, brilliant, that's fantastic. But you could have some absolute nut job putting a podcast together, getting quote unquote experts to come and talk about something, and then the conspiracy theory wheel starts again. So this is what I mean. It's so muddy and it's so difficult and then you've got the argument of freedom of speech, and that's a whole different, kettle of fish. So it's very difficult I do agree. I think live discussion is where it should be, and equal, like balanced live discussion, not cherry picking guests that they know are going to say the right things. Actually having, there's been quite a lot of people who have spoken out about the vaccines who aren't crazy conspiracy theorists, but they're making quite a good point about it, and they just get black. There's been people who have gone on this morning. I haven't worked for this morning, so I can openly say that, who have gone on, and they've then been told to leave, and they're not allowed to come back on because they were saying stuff that didn't fit the agenda.
Really?
And that's not right. I think I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but she's been quite vocal about the vaccines, and she was basically told that she couldn't come back on, and then she kicked off about it on Twitter, and then they didn't invite her back on.
Well, I'm very conscious. There's so much more I could go into with this, and I've got a lot written down, but I'm very conscious of your time as well. So
thank you.
should we leave it there for now, and then
let's leave it there, and then we can pick up. I still haven't found my diary. I might actually be in this room that I've been barricaded in.